Okay, so this is a recording of my revision session for those of you studying in Inspector Calls as your Section A texts for English Lit Paper 2 on Monday. So key knowledge, you're going to answer one question on Inspector Calls. You'll get a choice of two. So you pick one, you'll then move to Section B. Section B is on power and conflict. Okay, one poem will be printed that you've been taught and you'll compare it to one other poem that you've studied in this collection. You don't answer on love and relationships or identities. Okay, you then move to Section C. Section C have two questions. You answer both, so you must mention methods in the second question as a priority. So you're going to be answering 4 questions on this exam, 1 on Inspector Calls, 1 on power and conflict, and then 2 from Section C on unseen poetry. Unseen poetry looks like this. Section C says Section C on it. Okay, so move to Section C after your power and conflict. You'll have one unseen poem that's worth 24 marks, spend 30 minutes on it. In the second unseen poem, we compare the first unseen to the second unseen. 1 comparative paragraph, 2 at most. You must mention methods. So simile, imagery, etc., how they create meaning. Okay, your timings are on there. So Section A for you lot is in Inspector Calls. 1 question, 45 minutes. Yeah, choice of 2, but you pick 1. 3 or 4 point essay with a thesis opening, ideally. No extract. Think about the writer. Power and conflict. 1 poem printed compared to another one that you studied. 45 minutes. Okay. I would have an introduction that talks about both the poems, the printed one and the one that you're choosing. I would then talk about the printed poem in 2 analysis paragraphs. I would then have 2 analysis paragraphs about the other text or the other poem that you've chosen. Keep bringing it back. Okay, at the end, have a quick conclusion that summarises both poems. When you move to Section C, 27.1 is the first unseen poem, and it has 1 question. Spend 30 minutes, 3 paragraphs. Roughly. Second unseen poem, spend 15 minutes, compare the first unseen to the second. You've got to talk about methods, okay? So in this whole exam, you will answer 4 questions. 1 on Inspector Calls, 1 on power and conflict comparison, and then the 2 unseen questions. Okay, and Inspector Calls then, key ideas. So the play was performed firstly in 1945, and 1945 was a time of jubilation at the end of war. The war had been a pivotal moment in the way that society looked at things. People didn't want to return to class-based society of pre-war. Priestley sets his play in 1912 to show his 1945 audience that old ways were ridiculous. He wants us to think the Burlings are old-fashioned from a time that's gone. Okay, Priestley was a socialist voice, and that socialist voice had a focus on equality. Through his presentation, the Burling family attempts to show that the wealthy and powerful are abusers of the system. And we see that through Eric. You know, he treats Eva as an animal, a thing, not a person. Or Gerald, who insists that any man would have done the same with what he's done. Eva Smith is a representation of the normal, ordinary, working-class women of the time. She dies at the mercy of the rich and the powerful, who don't ask for the earth, but take it, according to the inspector. Okay, ignore that. The inspector is the voice of Priestley on the stage. Okay, the inspector looks like the audience. He's got a dark plainish suit of the period, and that's in contrast to the Burlings, who are in the ball gowns and the tails. Visually, in the way that he speaks, he is the contrast to the Burlings. Okay, he's very forceful in his delivery, and that links to the idea that Priestley wanted to forcefully teach a lesson. Okay, there's an implied patriarchy within the text, or male dominance. Eva and Edna, the 2 working class women, they have no real dialogue. They don't have lines, apart from Edna, who says, "Yes, sir." It shows the idea that working class women are forced to live in silence. Sheila, as an upper class woman, is infantilized by her family. Run along, Sheila, and she describes as being hysterical, suggesting that emotions make her weak in the eyes of Burlings. Okay, things that you need to know. This play is a morality play. Okay, namely a play that attempts to teach a lesson to those who watch it. The Burlings are taught a lesson, and some, the younger generation, take it, but the older generation dismiss it. This is Priestley's symbol for life itself. Some people will find change impossible, and it's the young, he thought, who carry the option to change. The Burling family collectively can be seen to embody the idea of the 7 deadly sins. You know, for example, Sheila is governed by envy in the way that she reacts. Okay, Eric is sloth and greed, and Burling's greed. The idea of Eva is virtuous. She's a working class woman who shows virtue. She's charitable. She thinks of others. She's resolute. She's got dignity and stuff. The inspector should be seen. You should see the inspector as a moralising figure. He's there to bring morals. Remember, we're told he's got an air of massiveness, while light symbolising he'll shine light on the truth. I think the Titanic's really important. Berling in Act 1 talks with loads of dramatic irony about all the things he does and doesn't think of life. He talks about how there is fiddlesticks. The Germans don't want war. Now the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. We know as an audience he's wrong on both counts, and Priestley intentionally prejudices the audience against a man to see him as a bit of a villain and a bit ridiculous and a bit of a typecast. Okay, the Titanic's a really key image in this play. The Titanic symbolised wealth, opulence, luxury in the Edwardian 9-12 times. It's a symbol also of what Berling thinks is the right class pyramid. Okay, on the Titanic, the rich cabins were at the top, and then the poor cabins were at the bottom. And that's like a pyramid, and that's how Berling sees society. The rich are at the top, and the poor are at the bottom. And Berling, lauding this idea of the Titanic as symbolic of a man. Remember, he represents the privileged elite who's just stuck in the past. Okay, Eva's constantly described as being pretty in this text. The word pretty is used loads, okay? Much like Dickens in A Christmas Carol, Priestley wants to humanise the poor by describing her as pretty. He wants to make her sound like a human. The poor aren't monsters, that's what he says. And they can be beautiful too. And listen, by describing her as pretty all the time makes it sound innocent, vulnerable, and makes the Berling sound more sinister. That dining table at the beginning is a really important symbol. It prejudices the audience against the characters of the Berlings. Okay, there are descriptions of dessert plates, champagne flutes, decanters, port glasses. This is in front of a 1945 audience who are living with rationing. These Berlings seem over elaborate, self-celebratory, over the top. The way that Eric takes the decanter and helps himself is a metaphor of how the rich take whatever luxuries they want without a care for others or without even asking. It foreshadows how he takes Eva and how he then takes money from Berling. Community and socialism is important. Priestley thought that community was everything, but it's not what the Berlings believe. Berling says community and all that nonsense, developing the idea that he's dismissive about the idea of being together. Okay, he sees himself as a hard-headed man of business. That's a metaphor that strength and power means to be hard against thoughts of others. You need to give yourself a shell that doesn't allow for other people to kind of penetrate it. Mrs. Berling's the same. Think about how she talks about girls of that class. She runs a charity, but she's dead demeaning, and it suggests that women like Eva are dehumanised by other women. It's the opposite of the inspector. He says we're members of one body. Okay, he personifies us all, and he implies that community is one being, and when it's broken, one part is taken away, like in the human body, whole society can die. This lack of female unity is important, okay? Another thing that we see is that Mrs. Berling treats her daughter with a bit of contempt and hatred, and she's really patronising. She says, run along, Sheila, and she calls her hysterical, okay? She tells the male characters that she must be overtired, like she's a toddler. The way that she demeans Eva as a girl of that class with ridiculous airs also shows Priestley's big point. What chance do these young women have if other women don't stand by them? I want you to just think about the inspectorization of the younger generation. Sheila and Eric begin as sheltered little children, really. Think about what Sheila says. Mummy, isn't it a beauty? How she describes Eric as squiffy and how he takes the decanter and helps himself. They both show they have little care, they don't have any stress, they live a life of shelter, privilege and hedonism, enjoyment. But by the end, we see that the language changes. Sheila talks in more visceral terms. He's given us rope to hang ourselves about the inspector. And think about how Eric says, you killed her, damn you. And these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. The language change is Priestley's metaphor that the young can evolve, change, find emotion, sorrow. And I want you to think of an absolutely key symbol in this play, and that's the ring. When Sheila hands that ring back to Gerald and says that she won't accept it, it's a symbolic moment of the play. She is refusing. She's giving back the old life, and she's basically saying, that ring is old life and I'm looking to the new. Okay, Priestley asks us to idolise her change. Okay, so thinking about exam questions, so you get 2 questions, you pick one. So look at these here. How does Priestley use the inspector to show that society needs to change? Or how does Priestley present the way that women are treated in the play Inspector Calls? Okay, so there are 2 examples. So if I was thinking about how does he use the inspector to show society needs to change, I'd look at that. So Priestley uses the inspector to call out the concept of inequality. He suggests that society needs to be forced to change, okay? So when the inspector first comes, he's got an air of massiveness, the light turns from white and not pink and intimate. Okay, point 2, he speaks in a forceful way, forcing people to change as well. Think about that visceral idea, burnt her insides out, makes Eva, representative of the working class women, sound like a victim. Okay, Eric's told that he treated her as an animal thing, not a person. And then, really importantly, the inspector is used to call out the greed or avarice of those who are privileged. Okay, he says that people are going to be taught their lesson in fire, blood, and anguish, or in hell, and it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. There's an example of one of those points written up. You might pause it and have a look at this. Think about how often I talk about Priestley indicates, and think about where I go beyond what a quotation means to what it symbolises. Okay. Here's another question that some people might answer. Okay, how are women treated? Listen, I've got a few quotations here. Okay, she was a lively, good-looking girl, country bred, I fancy. She'd be working in one of the machine shops for over a year. Okay, think about how Berlin talks about Eva Smith there as if she's an animal. Country bred, as if these women are created for the upper class men. Okay, think about how he calls her a girl, patronising really. Okay, she's a woman, but he treats her like she's a child. So you might pause it and look at those inferences. Okay, Gerald does the same. Okay, he talks about her as an object rather than a real person. She was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful. I became the most important person in her life. You might pause it and look at those inferences. But, think about how he talks about it in quite a kind of sinister, kind of almost grooming way, young, pretty, stuff like that. And he also sees himself as like the superhero, okay? He's an arrogant, rich man, and he's a blindness to the idea that he thinks because she's poor and he's rich, then all of a sudden she is going to be falling at his feet. Yeah, you might look at that. This is Gerald again. I hate those hard-eyed, doe-faced women, but then I noticed the girl looked quite different. She was pretty, soft brown hair and big dark eyes. Breaks off, my God. The inherent misogyny of Gerald's presented here, okay? A hatred of women, doe-eyed and hard-eyed, and doe-faced. He presents these women as being monsters because they're poor, basically. And again, as a man of richness, he speaks about her as if she's an object, Eva, to own. He talks about the aesthetics of how she looks, and it's just all a bit sinister. We've talked about this quotation before, like an animal, a thing, not a person, really important one. Okay, think of those nouns to become less substantial and more faceless as the list develops. It's as though the character is nothing, think about the sound of it spat out with venom and force. Okay, voice of Priestley, the inspector. Sheila is patronised despite being empowered to change. Run along, Sheila, that imperative. Okay, Burling speaks to his own daughter as if she is a child. We know that she's the one who was the most intelligent. She realises the importance of the inspector before anyone. It's bound to be unpleasant, said by Gerald, okay? He thinks that he's being chivalrous, but basically he's just trying to hide the truth. There's this idea that women should be sheltered from real life. That's what Gerald thinks, and that's why Sheila refuses to marry him at the end, okay? Because he's from a time past. The significance of giving back the ring is something we talked about. An essential prop with old life. When she gives it back, it's empowering. Stage direction, the way that she cuts in. Okay, she's got force of personality at the end. She starts with mummy, isn't it a beauty? And then by the end, she's taking charge. Okay, she cuts through the lies of her parents. Real symbolic quotation there. How does Priestley present the way that women is treated in the play Inspector Calls? Okay. Okay, you might look at my first point there. Again, think about how I talk about Priestley. Think about where to think about what quotations represent. Okay, power and conflict poetry. At this point, I want you to use that PDF document on the VLE in quotation booklets folder and on your satchel that has 4 or 5 quotations on each poem. Okay, you need to know each poem well enough that if you were talking about it, if it was printed, and then you'll probably have 6 to 10 that are your real keys. Okay. Yeah, so use that. It's your most important revision resource, okay? If you know the quotations on those grids that are put on your satchel, PDF, power and conflict grids, also on the VLE, you'll be okay. Key themes, nature and nature's power, you see in those. Identity, checking out my history. One I think that you should really revise, checking out my history, okay? And the emigre. Again, those two, they would be my guess that one of those will be your printed poem. War and conflict, exposure, most important poem, hits nature and war perfectly, Charge the Lab-Gate, bayonet charge. And then we also have this never-ending torment of conflict. War photographer, remains, poppies, the idea that conflict lives with us. We talked about PTSD as well. Okay, so here's a few questions, practice questions. How are ideas about powerful identities presented in the emigre in one other poem? If I was answering that, I would talk about checking out my history. Okay, and this is what I do. So my thesis, okay, that's my introduction that compares both poems. Okay, so I've got it there. Then I've got 2 points about the emigre, 1 and 2, and then I've got point 3 and 4 are about checking out my history. Okay, remembering checking out my history starts by being bandaged and blinded to his own identity. He then talks about what he's been taught as if it's a nursery rhyme, an alternate rhyme, and then by the end he's carving out his own identity. If you carve something, you do it forever. Okay. When he talks about his own culture, they're in italicized stanzas. He writes them in free verse. He won't be constrained or kind of controlled. There's the motif of light that runs and seeing that runs through them. Okay. There's also enjambment. It's like an outpouring. So when he talks about his own culture, nothing constrains him. When he talks about what he's taught, it's in very kind of constrained stanzas. It sound like a nursery rhyme. Okay, another question that is typical. How is the power of nature shown in Storm on the Island and one other poem? Okay, when we look at Storm on the Island, it starts with lots of journal pause. We are prepared, : we build our houses squat, full stop, sink walls and rock and roof and good slate, full stop. It's really kind of ordered and controlled because it links to the speaker that thinks that they are in charge at the beginning, but then it moves to total enjambment. When nature gets involved, suddenly it turns to chaos. Okay, so if I was answering that question, I'd compare it to exposure. Again, you'll see me thesis that compares them both, and then you'll see me 2 points about Storm on the Island. There'll be 2 points then about exposure that I would link at the end. Okay, remember in exposure, Owen was a soldier, and he said that nature is more powerful than the fine themselves. Icy wind that knives us. Okay, personification of the weather as cold, merciless, evil, killer. Think about that verb choice of knives. It sounds absolutely demonic and crazed and frantic. Mad gust at tug. If in doubt, look at the verbs. Dawn masses a melancholy army. Okay, dawn should be a time of new start, but it's all grey and stuff like that. By the end, people become ghosts that drag home. The love of God seems dying. Okay, weather's so powerful it destroys our faith. Okay, so there's an example of the beginning of a response to poetry. Have a look. Think about how I'm layering my analysis. Okay, from last year, this is a top band response from last year. Let's compare Miles Duchess and Ozymandias. So you'll see they have a thesis introduction there. That first paragraph is about Miles Duchess. And then think about how it moves into individual words, what language represents in a broad sense. You might pause this and just look at that. There's the end of it. Look how it focuses on writer's intention. Okay. Section C, then unseen poetry, 24 marks. Read the question before reading the poem. It'll tell you what the poem's about. Be brave, you'll be fine. Okay. There's an example of a typical unseen poetry question. Okay. In Shoulders, how does the poem present ideas about the importance of protecting and taking care of each other? For you, it'll be question 27.1. Remember, it's section C. Here's an example from last year that got full marks. Okay, note how it begins with a thesis opening about what the candidate said the poem represented, and then it just analyses the language and some structural things. Okay, you might pause it and have a look. Just look at the layers in there. Just thinking about what's symbolised. 8-mark comparison at the end, then 15 minutes. You compare that unseen poem to another unseen poem that's printed. Remember, you've got to talk about methods. I've got sentence starts there. And, there's an example of the kind of question you'll be asked. Okay, so what are the similarities and or differences between the methods the poets use to present these ideas? No methods, no marks. There's an example from last year. Okay, 15 minutes. It talks about both poems, but it mentions methods. Look how it talks about the semantic field in the first one and the imagery of nature in the second one. Okay, and it talks about how the writers use those methods. So 2 hours 15 minutes, 45 on Inspector Calls, 45 on Power and Conflict, 30 on the first unseen, 15 on the second. Okay, hopefully this video is useful. Pause it, make your notes, and like I say, use those Power and Conflict grids on PDF. They're essential for your revision. Okay.